I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so I thought dressing like a pimp might make it a little bit easier. I have blogs where you can read stuff and see things and interact with me. My main one is postmortemstudios.wordpress.com. My writing one and sort of diary blog is over at talesofgrim.wordpress.com. Hope to see you there. So, just as I come to review and flip through Curse of Strahd, they release information that the next book coming out is going to be Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, which kind of negates a lot of the problems that I had with this book, though it doesn't negate them, obviously, if you view this as a standalone book. However, I'm going to press ahead with my original criticisms because it remains to be seen what Van Richten's Guide is exactly going to be, and based on the previews that they've offered to places like Polygon, I'm not particularly hopeful. So just to frame that, let's first look over what the new release is likely to be. These quotes are from Polygon. Lamordia, which is one of the realms, a sort of Frankenstein realm, is home to Dr. Victra Mordenheim, who chases her escaped flesh golem Elise across the land. Falkovnia has a new ruler named Vladiska Drakov and has been reimagined as a realm on the brink of a zombie apocalypse. There's Kalakeri, which draws its inspiration from Indian folklore and mythology, where Dark Lords Ramya, Arayani, and Riva each vie for control. The last realm teased is called Valakan, where the Dark Lord Chakuna relentlessly hunts down player characters for sport. So it looks like they've gender swapped a lot of the stuff without any justification, and they've failed to draw on the original inspiration for Ravenloft, which was very much the gothic horror movies of the 60s and 70s, Hammer Horror, the Universal monsters, and have instead decided to change things arbitrarily and for no particularly good reason. Now, I saw a tweet by one of the creators of the new book talking about all the research into Indian mythology that they had done. I thought that was to do with the travelling people, because in real life the Roma are in some parts derived from wandering peoples from northern India, or so I'm given to understand. So researching India would have a very limited applicability to the Roma stand-ins within Ravenloft. But instead they've made a whole new world which doesn't really fit into the genre that Ravenloft was always trying to emulate. And so it might be really good, I don't know, but it seems like it's just being crammed in there as possibly Valakan is being, in a way that doesn't work or doesn't particularly fit, in order to increase diversity. It's the same reason that they seem to have done these arbitrary gender swaps, which yet again is disrespectful and misrepresentative of the work that came before what was done for it. And I know some of the people who worked on the original Ravenloft playtesting it or contributing in one manner or another, and they're not particularly happy about this either. So something that we've banged on about in a lot of videos and live streams and so on is there's just basic lack of respect and historical revisionism when it comes to D&D, representing it as some god-awful, sexist, misogynist, gate-kept area, none of which is true. And that misapprehension seems to be guiding a lot of the new development, and frankly, it can fuck off. Another passage in the Polygon article that gave me pause for concern was this. A horror role-playing game is much more personal and much longer than a film or television show. It also doesn't have an off switch, Schneider said during the preview event. So if somebody does get uncomfortable at the table, if it turns out that the whole story is about secretly the worst thing that ever happened in your life, what do you do with that? How do you avoid getting into that situation? How do you get out of it? And how do you make sure that your entire game group is being supportive of those things? This does not fill me with a great deal of confidence, because what is the point of horror if it doesn't horrify or disgust or repel or unsettle you. That is the goal of horror. So if you get rid of that as a goal, if you deny that as a goal, if you allow people to disrupt the game in some way while you're engaged in that, you're not only denying all the other players at the table and the hard work the Games Master has done, you're also denying yourself the experience of horror, right? This is the point of horror. So these are the opposite of problems when it comes to horror games and so on. And even if you have your own personal triggers and so on, the science suggests that controlled exposure to these sorts of things in a safe environment, like, oh, I don't know, say a tabletop role-playing game, is actually a very healthy way of progressing and overcoming those problems, whereas problematizing them and overreacting to them when they do come up has the opposite effect. The article goes on. To avoid repeating past mistakes, Wizard said it worked closely with cultural consultants on Van Richten's guide. Most importantly, Wizard stressed that this campaign book was created with all ages in mind. Again, this does not exactly fill me with confidence. The constraints of child-friendly are seriously going to impact on the ability of the game to be horrific. And yet, at the same time, if we look at a lot of what you might call children's horror, Goosebumps and so on, things to be afraid of in the dark, those sort of things, they are quite often genuinely unsettling and horrifying. This is even more true when it comes to children's horror literature rather than the TV series, and I know some of those are both one thing and the other. So this is misguided and ineffective, and unfortunately, if they dumb it down and soften it to the point of being kid-friendly, you're going to have problems running it as a horror scenario for jaded adults, certainly, and for children. So they go on. We understand that many folks these days play with their kids, play with younger players, Schneider said. Horror doesn't need to mean an R-rated movie. It doesn't mean for adults only. You don't need to bring your parents with you to see this D&D experience. Horror can be cartoons like Scooby-Doo. No, that Scooby-Doo's not horror. Or the old Ghostbusters cartoon, not really horror either. Can be those sorts of things have horror elements to them, while also being action stories, adventure stories, mystery stories, suspenseful stories. It doesn't need to be all gory and visceral. It doesn't need to be gory and visceral, but you don't have to be gory and visceral to unsettle people. Horror is one of the hardest genres to make work, second only to comedy, I think, when it comes to tabletop games. And as such, every roadblock, every extra difficulty you put in the way makes it less and less likely that you're going to hit that horror sweet spot. And unfortunately, that seems to be the tack that they've taken. But with that preamble out the way, because fuck me, that's why, Curse of Strahd. Now, this is not a setting book, per se. And following the seeming tradition of 5th edition, I wasn't really expecting a full-on setting book of any sort. But that was disappointing, because Ravenloft is so individual, so different, that it really merited some sort of setting book. But at the time, obviously, Van Richten's and so on wasn't announced, and so this was a deep criticism that I had of this, that it wasn't a setting book. Now, how good Van Richten's is likely to be, I don't know. Not hopeful, as we've just covered. But it is definitely something that's missing from this. Now, that's fine if you just railroad the adventure, this mini campaign that's presented here, because you're not going to stray off the edges of the map particularly. But if you want to play a more free-roaming game, or you're in love with the Ravenloft setting and this is all you have to go on, there isn't really enough there. Now, of course, you can access D&D wiki articles, which can perhaps tell you a bit more, or you can get hold of the older edition material for Ravenloft. But, you know, that's extra work, and they have changed things, and some people are really sticklers for following canon in a way that makes things difficult. Now, Ravenloft is supposed to be a gothic horror setting, and this is sort of a soft reboot, so it's kind of ignoring the things that happened in 2nd and 3rd edition and rebuilding from the ground up. However, it's not so much playing into the influences that formed the original Ravenloft, the Universal monsters, the Hammer horror films. And it's hard to discern where exactly it is getting its influence from, given that it doesn't seem to be coming from those things anymore. And as such, the setting is somewhat weaker, more anemic, has less vision behind it than the older editions support for Ravenloft did. It just, whether it's a result of younger writers excuse me, who don't know those influences, haven't watched those influences, I don't know, but it definitely comes through in the text. And given the things that have been said about Van Richten's as well, just to go back to that for a second, I don't think the people involved there necessarily know those influences. I could be wrong, they could just be ignoring them. And also it's being written basically by committee in the same way Candlekeep has been. So I don't think there's going to be a great deal of appeal for traditional, more mature, more experienced players and games masters in the same way that Candlekeep just seems ridiculous in a lot of ways when you look at it. So this is very much an adventure more than a setting. A loose string of encounters. It's slightly less combative, it's slightly less battle, explore than a lot of their settings are. There's a lot more opportunity for roleplay, which is one thing that's welcome, I suppose. What is useful is that it makes full use of the old Tarokka cards, how to read them, how that can affect the adventure, though it ties specifically to this adventure. There's less in the way of sort of generic use of Tarokka cards in your own games, in other settings and so on, but yeah, it's easily mangleable, easily ripped off. And I've always liked cards as props and even as used for systems, so it's nice to see it incorporated to that extent. Was it worth shelling out for a set of Tarokka cards, given how limited a role they actually play in the game? I'm not so sure, but like I say, I'm a sucker for cards. I like collecting them, particularly tarot cards or tarot-like material. So what you have here is a semi-open world, I guess. There is a strand of adventure which you can move slightly beyond in one direction or the other. Not to the same extent that Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden did. Excuse me. But you can stray a little bit, but you are still very much led by the nose, and that's always the problem with published scenarios. You can't help but lead people by the nose quite a lot. Yeah, this is unfortunate. The description is patchy, I have in my notes here on reviewing it, but obviously now we know that Van Richten's is coming out, hopefully those patches will be filled in a bit, so you won't be missing quite as much information. But then you've got to wonder why bring out the adventure before before the full setting, rather than vice versa. It's a little confusing. Maybe they were testing the waters to see whether there was enough enthusiasm for Ravenloft before they brought out the full setting. But then I don't know, with the development lead time, it looks like both were overlapped a bit, I think. Who knows? Who knows? One exception to this detail is Castle Ravenloft, which seems to still have more fulsome descriptions. But I guess because it's such a central and important point, they felt that it was worth spending the extra time on Castle Ravenloft. However, looking at the map of Castle Ravenloft and some of the other maps as well, they're very cramped, so it's not necessarily particularly suitable if you use minis and maps. It's more suited to theatre of the mind, because the constricted movement and frontage issues, marching order and so on, are going to make it a lot more of a bitch to play out as miniatures combat than it is in theatre of the mind. Now, maybe that's realistic. You know, castles are meant to be defensible, and if you've got narrow corridors and narrow doors and so on, then, you know, one man can hold off a horde for a long time. So that's something that can happen. But from a playing point of view, it does make it more difficult, and perhaps could make some of the encounters more deadly than they would otherwise be. So you might want to rejig how many experience points, what sort of challenge level you consider the encounter to be, based on how difficult a time they have with it and the environs in which the fight takes place. Horror, as I said, is one of the hardest genres of game to make work, second only to comedy, to repeat myself. And honestly, 5th edition D&D is not really very suited to horror. Old school, with its limited hit points, limited healing, and so on, is much more suited to horror. If you played the original Resident Evils, then you know that resource management can be a big part of horror games and of survival horror games. Do I take this? Do I take that? Do I take the book of matches or the gun? And then you find yourself in the dark, eaten by a grue. 5th edition, with its easy healing, with its virtually unlimited healing, with the sheer difficulty that the system creates in genuinely harming or disadvantaging or even killing characters, really takes the sting and the threat out of any horror. It's like taking one of Schwarzenegger's characters, say the Commando character, John Matrix, taking him and dropping him into a Hammer horror film and having him just gun down Dracula in the first 5 minutes of the movie, because he's just that good, that powerful. 5e characters are very much overpowered and far too capable and far too resilient to ever really feel the threat of horror that you might from a more old school game, or even 3rd edition, which some people decried as being too soft. So already, even before we get into the bullshit I talked about with Van Richten's, already we can see that the odds are stacked against you in successfully conveying a sense of horror, a sense of desperation, a sense of threat in 5th edition, because it's just really not suited for it. And of course, the adventure campaign that we have here, you can't really review adventures without creating spoilers. And as I said before, you know, the problem with a lot of these modules is that a lot of people stream them, so people are familiar with the game before they come in. But the adventure is really a standard MacGuffin hunt, and it doesn't really have much in the sense of horror really going through it. It's just that there's kind of vaguely horror-themed antagonists, and that's really it. There are some nice backgrounds, the haunted background. There are some nice trinkets and magic items. Those are always welcome. You know, additional options for that sort of thing are always welcome. But then the prevalence of magic items in 5th edition is something that sucks the life out of the horror genre. If you don't want to get the cards, you can always print them out from the back of the book, or photocopy them and cut them out, depending on whether you got the PDF or not. There's handouts which similarly you can copy and so on. I wish they'd kind of done these as a tear out section or something, just to make things easier if you buy the book. There's a nice map, which I tend to leave in the books because I don't want them to get crumpled. And that's pretty much the end of it. So what you have here at the end of all that song and dance is a somewhat railroaded mini campaign, trying to be horror, or not even particularly trying that hard to be horror, in a system that is deeply unsuited to horror, and missing a lot of the information that you would really need to properly run a Ravenloft campaign, unfortunately. So I can't really recommend getting this and playing it without Van Richten's, but we haven't seen Van Richten's yet, and from what I've seen, I don't think I want to. In terms of style, workmanlike. You expect more from Wizards of the Coast. Some of the art's nice, and it's a bit muddy, which seems to be a problem with a lot of Wizards printing. It's just not enough contrast to really make the stuff pop on the page, unfortunately, especially when you go for a somewhat parchmenty style off-white background. That really prevents things from popping off the page as well. it doesn't really convey horror very well, and it doesn't represent its influences very well. So style, I mean, I have to give it 3 because Wizards as standard has high production values, but it's just meh. In terms of substance, it's definitely missing a lot of what you need. Of course, we know about Van Richten's now, but even so, as a sort of standalone piece of material, I think if you're really going to make it into the kind of more open, semi-free roaming campaign that they imply that they want, you're going to need to get the Ravenloft information from elsewhere about various places and so on. So it doesn't feel complete in the way it should. I mean, I applaud a more open structure, but even so. So I'm only going to give it a 3 for substance as well. So that's 6 out of 10. 3 out of 5. Deeply, deeply average. Zang. Postmortem Studios. Role-playing games. And a lot more to die for. Post-mort.com.
Now, Bob, consider this next question very carefully. What is your one purpose in life?
To explode, of course.